75 years ago, on April the 1st, 1918 to be precise, the Royal Air Force was born. But I wonder what its great father figure, Lord Trenchard, and his gallant pilots of 3/4 of a century ago would have said had they seen what you and I are looking at now. You join me in a Hawk advanced jet trainer of number 74, the famous Tiger Squadron. Beside and behind us, 19 identical aircraft at 1,500 feet and getting on for 300 knots. Together, we write in the sky the figure 75 to celebrate that anniversary. And within that celebration, we shall trace, as best we may, the history of the Royal Air Force.
From the Sopwith biplane to its direct descendant, the Harrier jump jet. A remarkable history of progress, itself exemplified by the RAF's motto, per ardua ad astra, by diligence to the stars. From the outset, Lord Trenchard fostered the public image of his fledgling service. In 1920, he staged the first RAF air pageant at Hendon. As an annual event, it drew huge crowds and helped to offset the post-war clamour for disarmament. He appointed the distinguished composer Walford Davis as director of RAF music and established a tradition of excellence maintained to this day.
Trenchard realized the necessity for specialist skills in his new service. And so in 1920, he established number 1 School of Technical Training at Halton, where bright boys from school were enlisted as aircraft apprentices to learn their trade. Many went on to achieve great distinction, not least Sir Frank Whittle. Halton was closed earlier this year. Its role transferred to Cosford. But today at the RAF Museum at Hendon, ex-apprentices, or Trenchard's brats as they were affectionately known, gather to celebrate its illustrious past.
For his officers, he created the RAF College at Cranwell as the equivalent of the Army's Sandhurst and the Navy's Dartmouth, but also to include flying training. And for that most critical requirement, Trenchard embraced the Avro 504, as well as the proven skills and reputation of the Central Flying School, which had been founded at Uphaven in 1912 and had transformed learning to fly from a hit-or-miss hazard to a scientific discipline. The demands of empire provided Trenchard with an immediate operational opportunity to provide an effective backup to the Pax Britannica, particularly in the hostile terrain of the Near and Middle East and the Northwest frontier. This was Biggles' time, when its dashing pilots regarded the RAF as the best flying club in the world. And still flying today, this aircraft, the Hawker Hind light bomber, reminds us of the incomparable contribution of Sir Sidney Cam and his designs for successive generations of Hawker aircraft for the RAF. The pursuit of technological progress in the air was a high priority. As early as 1935, the Royal Air Force was experimenting with this pressurized suit, and on the 30th of June 1937, Flight Lieutenant Maurice Adam established a world altitude record of 53,936 feet in a Bristol 138. In 1929, Flying Officer Waghorn, flying a Supermarine S-6, had won the Schneider Trophy with an average speed of 328 miles an hour. 2 years later, a third successive victory would win the trophy outright for Great Britain. And in 1938, the Vickers Wellesley established a world long-distance record by flying 7,162 miles in 48 hours non-stop from Ismailia, Egypt to Darwin, Australia.
Effectively, the Royal Air Force had changed little from its First World War origins, but belatedly in 1936, it was to be modernized. At last, it was realized that Germany, not France, was the potential threat. Millions of pounds were invested in new airfields and equipment, and 4 separate commands were established: fighter, bomber training, and coastal command, of which this short Sunderland flying boat, which first flew in 1937, was to become flagship and queen of the western approaches.
Sidney Cam's Hawker Hurricane made its maiden flight in November 1935, and R.J. Mitchell's Vickers Supermarine Spitfire first flew in March 1936. Both 8-gun aircraft, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin, were to become the spearhead of fighter command. The Schneider Trophy races had proved the concept of the high-performance monoplane and effectively indeed the Merlin, but the Air Council had for too long been preoccupied with 2- and 4-gun biplanes, and the Hurricane and Spitfire arrived only in the very nick of time. The Bristol Blenheim was to provide a brilliant advance for the new Bomber Command, and its origin is as fascinating as its history is gallant. It had resulted from a private order by Lord Rothermere to the Bristol Aeroplane Company to build him an all-metal 6-seater with retractable undercarriage and capable of 240 miles an hour, considerably faster than RAF fighters of the time. It actually achieved 307 miles an hour, and the Air Ministry immediately ordered a military version. The Blenheim was to serve with distinction in all 3 operational commands.
The heavy metal of Bomber Command was to be provided by the Whitleys, the Hampdens, and this Barnes-Wallis design, the Vickers Wellington. 55 years ago, when it first came into service, the men who sat in this seat were the pick of the bunch. And from the outbreak of war, the Wellington proved itself magnificent. Its unique construction, fabric cover on all-metal geodetic lattice, made it capable of sustaining enormous punishment and surviving. It was very affectionately known to its crews as the Wimpy, a slightly skittish name for a truly gallant aeroplane.
Training Command was to receive the Tiger Moth. Developed by de Havilland from its family of civil light aircraft, the Tiger of 1932 was to be the RAF's first purpose-built first solo aeroplane, and it became the Empire's trainer. On the very eve of war in June 1939, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was formed. Dame Felicity Peake was commissioned into the new service in August 1939, and 7 years later she would become its director.
Well, its purpose was to release men for more dangerous tasks, and in those days, of course, flying was the most important, and still is, for the Royal Air Force, by substituting women in as many trades and officer branches as possible, as quickly as possible. Women couldn't fly in those days. They were not allowed to fly. I was very fortunate to be posted to an operational station just at the right time. And the girls were doing various jobs, and the most important of which, of course, at that time, was plotting. I think the number of trays rose from about 10 to almost sort of 80 or something like that, with all the offshoots of the various departments they worked in. Well, they were doing all the sort of ordinary and normal ones, like secretarial and driving, and they became aircraft fitters. They They did a lot to do with signals. The radar stations all around the coasts of London were manned almost entirely by women at that time. I've never known anything like it. I was on recruiting in the early days, and they'd come from far and wide, from everywhere in the British Isles to join, and they were all types and kinds, and absolutely marvellous.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, saying that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The Royal Air Force went into action literally in the very first hours of the war. And as the British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel, fighter, light bomber and reconnaissance squadrons were based in France in support. In what became the Battle of France, fairy battles like this were flown heroically. Indeed, VCs were won, but tragically they were totally outclassed by the opposition.
In spring 1940, the Germans struck. The BEF was trapped at Dunkirk, and although 338,000 men were evacuated, the army and its supporting RAF squadrons in France had been eliminated as a fighting force. Only the foresight of Lord Dowding had preserved the main strength of his fighter command for the forthcoming critical struggle with the Luftwaffe, the Battle of Britain. In the 3 months that it raged, the Battle of Britain shaped the course of world history. As Britain stood alone, against all the odds, the Luftwaffe was beaten back, and the United Kingdom was saved from imminent German invasion.
You went up to the average man in the street and said, "Do you know anything about the Battle of Britain?" And he'd say, "Oh yes, a few dashing young English officers flying Spitfires defeated the Germans." They weren't as few as all that, you know. People are very surprised, but there were nearly 3,000 of our people in the battle. Not at the same time, never more than about 700 at one time, but 3,000 actually qualified. If they were dashing, they didn't last very long. They weren't all young by any means. A lot of them were, of course, but people like Douglas Bader, Sailor Milan, well over 30, and some of the Poles and Czechs were over 40. By no means all officers. People forget that 1/3 of the pilots in the Battle of Britain were NCOs. And in fact, some of the air crew in the fighter Blenheims and Defiance weren't even NCOs, they were airmen. And they weren't flying Spitfires. 2/3 of the aircraft flying were Hurricanes. Everybody's heard of the Spitfires. So dashing young officers and so on, that's a 100% inaccurate statement.
Modern four-engined heavy bombers added new might to the RAF from 1941. This, the short Stirling, then the Handley Page Halifax, and the Avro Lancaster. With bomb loads up to 22,000 pounds, despite heavy losses, night after night, in ever-increasing numbers up to 1,000 strong, they pounded enemy targets all over Europe and carried the war to the very heart of the Nazi homeland. Those who had sown the wind were to reap the harvest. Mightiest of the heavyweights and cherished symbol of the awesome might of Bomber Command was the Avro Lancaster.
Despite its size, the crew of 7 were squeezed into their accommodation, not least the lowly tail-end Charlie in his power-operated rear turret. Equally cramped, despite his key role, was the navigator, as Jack Jones of 617 Squadron will never forget,
It wasn't exactly a comfortable ride, Jack.
Certainly not, no. It was very cramped and extremely cold.
And very frightening?
Well, yes,
From time to time.
sometimes.
How many raids did you fly, Jack?
Altogether 54,
Pretty good
but
score.
with 617 24.
And what was the most outstanding one?
Well, the most prestigious raid was when we led 318 Lancasters to Berchtesgaden. That was the last raid of the war over Germany. And
You were the lead navigator.
we were the leading crew, yes.
But you were doing the navigating and leading all the rest.
Indeed.
You're too modest, Jack. That's what you did.
Yes, that's true. That's quite true.
In 1943, Lancasters of 617 Squadron dropped the unique Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb. The attack had been practiced over Derwentwater, where 50 years later the Dambusters' golden anniversary would be celebrated by the Memorial Flight's City of Lincoln. Also to become legendary was the Mosquito. Built in secrecy as a private venture, it joined its first Squadron 105 in 1941. Powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlins, its fastest version was quicker than many a Spitfire. Others could carry a 4,000-pound bomb, and the wooden wonder served brilliantly in virtually every operational role, including high-speed transport. Comparatively few B-17 Flying Fortresses were acquired and operated by the RAF. But after America came into the war, in 1942, the US 8th and 9th Air Forces based in Britain launched mass formation raids by Fortresses and Liberators. Initially relying on their own guns for defense, their losses were catastrophic. But later, escorted by fighters, including RAF squadrons, they continued relentlessly in daylight the onslaught of Bomber Command by night. In 1941, as the 8th Army wrestled with Rommel in the desert, the RAF was joined by an ever-increasing tide of aircrew and squadrons from the Empire and Commonwealth, a never-to-be-forgotten chapter in the history of the RAF, and one which went from strength to strength in every theatre and made possible the all-important Empire Air Training Scheme. Still in frontline service with the Desert Air Force was the beautiful Gloucester Gladiator 4-gun biplane, which entered service as late as 1937. It had fought in the disastrous Norwegian campaign, but in the Siege of Malta, 3 of them, Faith, Hope and Charity, were to gain immortality. Which one did you fly, Jim?
Well, we flew all 3. We didn't have our own aircraft. It was change round.
And you were flying other airplanes as well at the time?
That's right, and Hurricanes.
How did you compare the Gladiator with the Hurricane?
Much more manoeuvrable, of course. Lovely aircraft to fly.
Quite apart from anything else, you were outgunned and always went up to meet the attack.
Yes, well, a fighter squadron, that's what you're there for. It's a defensive arm, and you're not really outgunned by the number of guns because it only wants one gun to be successful.
The responsibility for maritime operations was for many years a bone of contention between the RAF and the Royal Navy. But as vital to victory as any aspect of the Second World War was the Battle of the Atlantic. To help combat the stranglehold of Hitler's U-boats, Sunderlands, as well as Catalinas and later Liberators, sustained endless hours of long-range patrolling and eventually succeeded in closing the gap to afford convoy protection from one side of the ocean to the other. But the cost in lives, ships and aircraft was appalling. The exploits of Catalinas are legion. One found the Bismarck in mid-Atlantic. One taxied for more than 100 miles in the Pacific, too heavily laden with refugees to take off. And one attacked a Japanese aircraft carrier in daylight after transmitting the cryptic radio request, "Kindly inform next of kin." The Douglas DC-3 Dakota started life as an American airliner in 1935, but in the Second World War it became the great workhorse of the Allies. Some aircraft are a pleasure to fly, some a privilege. This one is both. It served in every theatre. It sustained beleaguered garrisons in the Far East and carried everything from mules to VIPs. It participated in every airborne action from the invasion of Sicily to D-Day and Arnhem. This one, the RAF's last, is the newest recruit to the memorial flight, where it enjoys, like me, an active retirement. Long before the Normandy landings, the 2nd Tactical Air Force had been formed to support and follow through the invasion. Squadrons of Typhoons played a leading role in ground attack in support of the army. The RAF returned to France, better equipped, better trained, more wise in warfare than in 1939. It had still to pursue a hard road to victory, but in that pursuit, as throughout its history, it never wavered. In 27 years, Trenchard's junior service had come of age.
Marching with guardsman step, the Royal Air Force column passes along the 5-mile route to the Royal Saluting Base in the Mall.
In terms of its equipment, the greatest single turning point in the history of the Royal Air Force was, of course, the dawn of the jet age at the end of the Second World War, and the first Allied jet to fly operationally 8 days before the German Messerschmitt Me-262 was the Gloucester Meteor. It first flew in March 1943 and joined 616 Squadron on the 12th of July 1944.
The Meteors are driven by 2 rocket-like engines through which air is sucked in at a tremendous rate, compressed, heated, and then ejected through the turbines and nozzles at the rear.
That contemporary newsreel description of the Meteor's Rolls-Royce gas turbines emphasizes their total novelty to the public, but to the Air Force they represented a new challenge in handling and maintenance and even fuel distribution. A year after the Meteor, the de Havilland Vampire came into service, to be followed by the Venom, both powered by de Havilland's own engines, easily distinguished by their sound and aptly named the Ghosts and Goblins. Both engines and aircraft proved extremely successful and launched the Royal Air Force confidently into the future.
Finally, Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, Chief Test Pilot of English Electric, pilots the latest version of the Canberra jet bomber, which is now going into production for the RAF.
The Canberra, which entered service in 1951, was another dramatic leap forward, capable of carrying a 6,000-pound bomb load over a radius of 750 miles, fast enough to evade interception, and with a service ceiling of 48,000 feet. The Canberra was so far ahead of its time that the Americans felt obliged to purchase the design. Next, in 1953, came the Hawker Hunter, undoubtedly the most successful post-war British fighter to date, beloved of test pilot Bill Bedford.
It looked a beautiful aeroplane with Sidney Cam's design and mark on it, 4 powerful 30mm cannons, a wide-track undercarriage forgiving to, the most agricultural type of pilot in the cockpit, and an aeroplane with a big wing and a high thrust-to-weight ratio. And of course it became a real pilot's aeroplane
The Hunter went easily supersonic in a shallow dive, and flown by Neville Duke, raised the world speed record to 727 miles an hour straight and level. It proved a formidable fighting aeroplane in Borneo, Malaya, Aden and Oman. The Swiss Air Force still uses Hunters for their display team 30 years after Treble 1 Squadron's Hunters, the Black Arrows, set new standards in formation aerobatics. The RAF's reputation for brilliant display continues generation after generation.
Flying high and handsome, the Red Arrows of the Royal Air Force set the scene and mood for the Farnborough Air Show, shop window of the British aircraft industry, which this year is rocketing towards a record £200 million export scoop.
Bill Loverseed, who was an ex-CFS NAT instructor, was an absolute ace on things that went on the inside of the airplane that most pilots aren't awfully interested in. And so if we ever had a problem, we'd say, "What is it, Bill?" And he'd come up and say, "Oh, it's this particular fuse and that particular fuse." And one day he said, "You know, if we pull fuse 13 out, we could get a marvellous rate of roll." The rate of roll, of course, you know, is this way. And on the NAT it was pretty fast, the rate of roll, you see. But if you pull this little fuse out, which is just like an electric fuse, you know, this put something into the system, and holy woof, it went round. So we went up this day and we pulled the fuses, and I said, "Back off," and they all backed off, and I took the stick and I said, "1, 2, 3, go." You see? So I thought, God, it's true. Come in, Henry, come in, Bill, come in, Jerry. They came into very close, about 200 yards. Rolling, rolling, go, and we did it. Marvellous. So a bit closer, bit closer. In the end, we were doing twinkle rolls in formation. Now, nobody did this. Nobody did this with this rate of roll, and it was fabulous. So we got Birdie Wilson, Air Marshal, Bird Wilson, and we said, "Could you have a look at this, sir?" You see? So he knew a thing or two, and he had a look at it, and he said, "Fantastic. What did you do?" So I said, "Well, just skill, really, sir." So he said, And of course, after a while, they caught on to what was happening, you see. And so they said, "You can't do that, because the girls at Boscombe Down, the test pilots, will have to take a year and a half to check it out, you know. I mean, they're overpaid, high-priced help. And they'd have to check it out. We couldn't finish it by the end of the season. So we thought, right. So the order was, replace the fuses immediately. What they didn't say was to replace them serviceable. So we got old Bill to blow all the fuses, and we put them back home.
For more than a quarter century, the Red Arrows have thrilled millions the world over and inspired many a schoolboy to become a pilot.
The Vickers Valiant, Britain's new four-jet bomber, enters squadron service with the RAF, the most powerful, costly and complex aircraft the Air Force has ever had. Each one is worth several £100,000, so only the cream of air crews are picked to fly them.
Its purpose was to spearhead an entirely new element within the RAF, the V Bomber Force. Its awesome responsibility was to be capable of delivering Britain's nuclear deterrent against the Soviet Union and its allies. Joining the Valiant the Avro Vulcan, the world's biggest flying delta, born from the same lineage as the Lancaster and Shackleton before it. And arguably the most advanced of the trio, the Handley-Page Victor. The Vickers Valiant was the first to go into service, thanks to the brilliant response of Sir George Edwards and his team at the Weybridge factory, already fully occupied building the world's first turboprop airliner, the Viscount.
Sir George, of all the aeroplanes you created, what gave you the most satisfaction?
Well, the old Valiant, without any doubt. In its time, I would think that the technical advance that we had to make in relation to the size and performance, and particularly against the time scale that we were bullied into keeping. I'd even go so far as to say that, taking all those into account, that it was more difficult than the Concorde, because the Concorde never had that sort of time scale attached to it, and it had mighty resources behind it. I think that pressure on the ability to launch an atomic bomb began to get a bit severe, because our friends at the other end of Europe were rattling their sabre a bit, which is always helpful, the chaps in the defence industry. We got the prototype out in the middle of '51 and the first production aeroplane out in December '53. I suppose we were best part of 3 or 4 years in front of the Vulcan and the Victor. We literally bashed on, and we were doing things before the wind tunnel said it was all right. We used every trick in the trade to get the timetable right. And at the end of it, we got the timetable right and we got the performance right.
24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Squadrons of the V-Force stood ready to be airborne within minutes, briefed and atomically armed to attack specific targets deep in the Soviet Union, prepared to risk their own sacrifice in the defense of peace. The English Electric Lightning epitomized a crisis period of a different kind. The notorious Defence White Paper of 1957 and subsequent governments caused major postponements and cancellations, including TSR-2. The Lightning was to be the RAF's first all-weather supersonic fighter. It first flew in 1954, but didn't come into service until 6 years later. Out of that very difficult period, Strike Command was formed in 1968.
The background really to forming Strike Command was that we had these 4 functional operational commands, fighter, bomber, coastal and transport, which were really interrelated in many respects in the modern operational conditions. And it was decided for 2 reasons. Firstly, to obtain greater operational efficiency by bringing them together, and secondly, to obtain a much needed compromise and saving in personnel, to put the whole lot together under one senior command, which was to be at the old Bomber Command at High Wycombe.
The Harrier brought with it a new dimension, literally, to the capability of Strike Command. But the development and application of its unique performance presented a challenge without precedent, not least to Chief Test Pilot John Farley.
The French Navy at one stage were going to have our aeroplane because they had no jet fighter that they thought was safe to fly from their decks at night. I wanted to show the French that additionally, when they got more used to it, they would be having an aeroplane which had got great flexibility. And so after our job was done, on the next day I said to the ship's captain, I said, just one thing I'd like to show you is the flexibility of the aeroplane. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I'd like to take off and you try and stop me landing on your ship. And so I took off and I watched this ship and he threw a hard left turn and he threw the anchor out, and this was in the Bay of Biscay and it was quite rough, and so this boat's just wallowing, you know, across the swell in the Bay of Biscay. And then he fires up all his smoke and he lays all that in a great cloud across the deck, and it's just a mess. And about 5 seconds after I landed, it wallowed to the right, and now I'm looking down here. And with the brakes on, this thing is just sliding across this wet deck, you see, and there's French sailors coming with ropes and chains and things. Next thing I know is it's rolling the other way, and it's sliding backwards, and I'm having to play the nozzles, you know, reverse thrust and forward thrust, trying to hold this thing on the flight deck. Having done my bit, I thought it was up to the Navy to grab the airplane then, but they didn't see it that way, and so I think that was probably the worst moment.
It was not only the Harrier's vertical takeoff and landing, but also its extreme maneuverability that made it a revolutionary fighting aeroplane. Of it, the founder of the great Hawker dynasty, Sir Tom Sopwith, said, "When I first saw it stop, fly backwards, fly sideways, go straight up and straight down, then I reckoned I'd seen everything." Following a checkered political history, the Buccaneer came to the RAF via the Royal Navy. It was designed for flight deck operation, but its rugged construction and just subsonic performance at sea level proved its value to Strike Command, and just before its eventual retirement, it was to finally prove its worth in the Gulf War as a laser target indicator. Strike Command's maritime commitment was to be led by the Nimrod. The design was based on the Comet, the world's first jet airliner, but the Nimrod went into service as the world's most sophisticated submarine detector. To conserve fuel, it can maintain patrol for over 12 hours with 2 of its 4 Rolls-Royce Spey engines shut down, and the Nimrod has frequently gained the headlines for its work in coordinating long-range maritime search and rescue. The VC-10 was also designed by Sir George Edwards as a civil jet liner, but from the outset it was ordered by the RAF along with BOAC as a long-range high-speed transport for passengers and freight. Later it was equipped as an in-flight refueling tanker and currently undertakes all 3 roles, as well as providing luxury accommodation for government VIPs, including, of course, service personnel and their families in transit. The American Lockheed Hercules, successor to the Dakota. The RAF has developed its own stretched version capable of in-flight refueling, and in both the Falklands and Gulf Wars, the Hercules proved invaluable, as it has in relief operations in Africa and currently the former Yugoslavia.
I'm a co-pilot on the Hercules at RAF Lynham. At Lynham we've got the route squadrons and we've got the tactical squadrons. I'm on a route squadron, which means that I spend most of my time travelling around the world, supporting exercises, doing casualty evacuations, going into places like Bosnia and resupplying there. If you're on the tactical squadrons, you tend to do more of the involvement with paratroopers, dropping paras, dropping loads out of the back and doing low level. Well, I was already in the Air Force as an administrator, and I was due to come out in a couple of years. I decided to pursue flying in the civilian world. So I took myself off to Texas and got a PPC in Texas in 3 weeks and came home. And in that time, the Air Force had decided to take women. So I was in the right place with the right qualifications. It's an excellent aircraft, really. At the end of the day, yes, it is. It's a big aircraft with 4 great big, noisy, smelly engines, but it's really probably one of the most successful aircraft we've got in the Air Force. It does all of its jobs so very well. It does what we bought it for very, very successfully. And really the glamour's not really why I'm there. I'm there because I love the aircraft.
The technique of in-flight refueling was pioneered in Britain by Sir Alan Cobham, and today its tanker fleet is fundamental to the operational capability of the Royal Air Force. Lockheed TriStar ex-airliners have been acquired to join the VC-10s and, until recently, the Victor tankers. Without them, the Gulf War could not have been fought. The RAF's interest in rotary wing aircraft predates the Second World War. Invented by the Spanish grandee Juan de la Cierva, the autogyro's lift was generated by freely windmilling blades. At the request of the Air Ministry, it was demonstrated at Farnborough in 1925, a partnership was established with AV-RO in 1927, and experiments continued until the war. But the advantages of the helicopter's power-driven rotor became apparent, and the Hoverfly, an American Sikorsky design, became the RAF's first operational helicopter in 1945. The Westland Whirlwind joined the service in 1954 and saw action in Borneo. Successive, more advanced designs have proved invaluable in the modern Royal Air Force.
My job is as a radar and winch operator on the Sea King helicopter. I navigate the aircraft from our base to the rescue using the radar. Once we get to the particular place of rescue, then I will become the winch operator, and I basically tell the pilot which way to move the aircraft when we're overhead the survivors, so that I can then use the winch to winch the winchman down to the survivors and so rescue them. Sometimes the weather conditions are such that it can actually be quite frightening, and we have to go out in all weathers, night and day. There are lots that actually I do remember over the time, but in particular 1980, when I was involved in the Alexander Keeland rig disaster, where we spent 10 hours airborne at night in pretty atrocious weather, trying to rescue survivors from the rig that had overturned. The Sea King is a very capable aircraft, and I think on that particular night it was the only aircraft that was capable of flying in those conditions.
In 1978, the Boeing Chinook twin-rotor helicopter was ordered for heavy duty. At the outbreak of the Falklands War, 5 were dispatched immediately in the Atlantic conveyor. 1 was dropped off at Ascension, and only 1 more was flown into action before the ship was sunk. The Falklands War confronted the British services with an horrendous problem: how to liberate the islands 12,000 miles from home. Despite the scrapping of its conventional steam catapult aircraft carriers, the Royal Navy was able to launch the Harriers against the enemy from the specifically designed ski jump decks of HMS Invincible and Hermes. Without that capability, what was a close-run thing could have been catastrophic. The Navy's Sea Harriers, reinforced by RAF pilots and aircraft, bore the brunt of the fighting in the air. If ever an aircraft won its spurs in war, it was the Harrier in the Falklands. The RAF's principal task was support via Ascension Island, and a non-stop supply shuttle flew in thousands of tons of stores and equipment. And the mighty Vulcan flew the longest raid in the history of air warfare to bomb the runway at Port Stanley, the only occasion in which it struck in anger before its ultimate replacement by the multi-role combat aircraft Tornado.
The multi-role combat aircraft, as it was first called, really came into being, I think, in the early 60s. Particularly after the cancellation of the TSR-2, which was a bit of a setback for us. But this new aeroplane, which eventually became known as the Tornado, as we know from subsequent operations, has performed admirably and is still doing so.
The Mach 2 Tornado resulted from a multinational agreement between Britain, Germany and Italy. The RAF was to receive two versions, one for air defense, the other a Striker. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, amongst the first to be deployed to the Gulf in Operation Granby were the Jaguars of RAF Coltishall. In squadron service since 1974, the Jaguars' performance and reliability had been well established. But when the build-up Operation Granby became the War Desert Storm, it was the Tornadoes which immediately wrote world headlines.
I was the Tornado weapons controller on the ground. Direct liaison between aircraft weapon loads and operations. In the Gulf we operated from dispersed sites. There were 3 sites out there. And my job was to get round the 3 sites, for which I had 2 weapons load teams per site, and basically just to ensure that the right weapons went on the right aeroplanes. I would like to say the buck has to go out the window, otherwise you can't achieve anything. I mean, to work within my world, which is explosive regulations, there's absolutely no way, in my personal opinion, that we could actually operate under any conditions, war conditions, with a written book. So I'm afraid the written book has to just take a little sidestep and we get on with the job. My job on the weapons side would be to load an aircraft once given the go-ahead. Depending on the load, again, if it was going to take 8,000 pounders or 2 times JP233, varying between an hour and a half to 2 hours, including its guns. We actually lost 4 aircraft in a week from Maharak Air Base. Those crews were taken prisoners of war, so we actually didn't lose the crews, but we didn't know that at the time. The hardest thing was for the troops they took a personal interest in their own aircraft. Tremendous feeling of loss. I think some of the lads found it difficult to try and show their emotions, but you could see straight away that they would walk away. You couldn't get a word out of them. They'd just drift away, quiet, you know. I could feel it definitely going from site to site, looking at these guys, if their aircraft didn't come back. I think everybody worked very hard. I mean, including the guys that were back at base supporting us, you know. The guys back home, and everybody, right down to the last man. I think that's what impressed me the most, the sheer professionalism of every individual.
The history of the Royal Air Force is punctuated by great names, both within and without the service. Some defied the politicians. Some defied the accepted rules of technology. Some defied the enemy in the face of fearful odds. But the people who made the Royal Air Force what it was and is today are anonymous. They are the men and women who were and still are prepared to serve, and simply to get on with the job in hand to the best of their ability, whatever the circumstances and however great the cost.